Hello and welcome to another episode of Special Needs Jungle in Conversation with me, Renata Blower.
And me, Tanya Tiroro. Well, we're hearing a lot about government plans for SEND. We've been looking at it on Special Needs Jungle. What are the opposition parties up to and how do they think SEND should be improved? So let's find out, and we're delighted to welcome our guest today, Labour's spokesperson on SEND, Helen Hayes MP. Welcome, Helen.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be with you today.
Helen became MP for Dulwich and West Norwood in South London in 2015 and began her role as Shadow Minister for Children and Early Years in December 2021. Before becoming an MP, Helen was a town planner. We recognise it was before your time as a Member of Parliament, but the 2012 Labour SEND review started by Sharon Hodgson seemingly went nowhere, and for years afterwards we heard little on SEND from Labour. You're now undergoing a policy review for your manifesto. How important is it to Labour to fix the crises facing education and SEND? Is it seen as a vote winner?
So it's really important. And I don't know the extent to which this is an issue that absolutely drives voting behaviour. But what we want to be doing as the Labour Party is setting out our vision for the whole country in a context where after 13 years of Conservative government, so many aspects of our public services are really struggling, if not completely broken. This area of policy, that the support that children with special educational needs and their families are able to access, having a system that really works to deliver support where it's needed and enable every child to fulfil their potential is a really important issue. And we are committed to getting to a plan that makes things better. The review that you mentioned that my colleague Sharon undertook, I have huge respect for Sharon as a colleague and a predecessor in this role, but that piece of work was started both quite a long time before I was elected to Parliament myself in 2015, but also before the important changes in the law around SEND that took place in 2014. So what's important for now is that we start with the legislation as it is at the moment and the system that is in place at the moment, to look at how that's working, and that we do that also in the context of the economy and taxation revenue and the capacity of the public sector to deliver additional resources, or perhaps not to be able to deliver additional resources in the short term, but we make a plan that starts from here and moves the situation on from there.
Well, you say, the capacity of local public services, local government. So where Labour controls the council, how much influence do you have on how it conducts itself and its children's services, particularly in the areas that have poor and often unlawful record on SEND and children's social care delivery? What can you do to stop Labour-controlled councils from acting unlawfully?
So I want to see every council really delivering its very best for children, and that's important for all councils, whatever their political hue. What we don't have is, I don't think any political party has it, is a system of command and control between elected members of Parliament and separately elected politicians in local government who have that responsibility for delivering in their area. But a thing that really concerns me with this government is the real lack of scrutiny and accountability and support and challenge for local authorities from central government. We have, and we will talk a lot about resources, and resources are really important, but even within the existing envelope of resources, we have enormously varying performance in different local authorities all across the country, and of local authorities of all different political colours, and that there seems to be really comparatively little interest and action from government at the centre in understanding why that is the case and in driving forward improvement. So of course, where there are councils that are really having a problem, or that there are issues that are very clear to see, I think politicians of any political party would be having a word with their colleagues about that. But we don't have, it's not a kind of line management arrangement. We don't have command and control. What I do want to see is leadership from the government that really has the power to do that, to drive improvement and get the system onto a better footing.
Because what they've done is the safety valve program that I'm sure you're across, but we are concerned that it's going to set LAs up, in direct conflict with the law, and we're actively trying to, see what's going on. Do you think that's the best way to move forward?
Well, it's a crisis solution, isn't it? It's not a system reform. So I think the government has to, where there is a crisis, the government has to think about crisis solutions that can plug those very significant gaps in funding. But what we need to see is a system that's working across the board so that local authorities are able to deliver without getting into that crisis situation of deficits and overspend in the way that's happening at the moment.
So we're obviously all aware of what the Conservatives are or aren't doing for families with children who have additional needs. But what's the Labour Party currently doing to help SEND families? And what more do you think Labour can do to help them before the next general election?
So what we have at the moment, so we're in opposition at the moment. The frustrating thing about being in opposition is that we get to see through our constituents and all of the people who get in touch how the current systems are failing, but we don't get to be able to legislate or pass budgets or write policy that can be implemented by the government, and that's enormously frustrating. That's the single most frustrating thing about being in opposition. So what we are all doing as Labour MPs, and you'll have heard this week in Education Oral Questions, several colleagues standing up on behalf of their constituents and asking, actually on both sides of the House, asking about the failures in SEND provision and asking what the government is doing about that. So there's an important role in terms of accountability and scrutiny, and there is an important role in relation to casework as well, and standing up on behalf of individual families who are getting in touch saying, I'm really struggling and I'm at the end of my tether. And I try to do that in my constituency. I have sat in meetings with families alongside them to provide that advocacy role where they're having difficult discussions with the local authority or with the school. I see families in my surgeries very, very frequently. I run surgery almost every week, and often have families coming to talk about the support and the challenges that they're facing in getting support for their children. And so it's trying to work practically at a local level, but it's in terms of the big picture, it's about trying to hold the government to account and to challenge them on the consequences of the decisions they've been making for the last 13 years.
Because we see, just when Labour often any opposition stands up to ask a question in the Commons, all you get batted back is, oh, we're doing the SEND review, or we've got the SEND improvement plan, and that's it. How can you gain any leverage when all you get is kind of shut down?
So that's frustrating, isn't it, when the government doesn't answer a question in enough detail, or is seemingly content to brush off very serious questions with headlines and with reference to plans that often aren't delivering the change that's needed. There is, I would say, a lot of work that goes on in addition to the work that happens in the House of Commons chamber. So I'm all the time putting down written questions, which are trying to sort of drill further into the data, get the government to provide more information, get them to set out in more detail exactly what they're doing. And so I would say the House, the House of Commons isn't the only aspect of the work that goes on.
So with that in mind, what is Labour's view of the SEND improvement plan?
So within my portfolio, I also have children's social care. And I always draw a distinction between the government's independent review of children's social care, which was commissioned by the government but produced by Josh McAllister, who was tasked with being independent, and the SEND review, which was an entirely internally produced piece of work. And I think that's a clue, really. There are. I think the SEND improvement plan is a flawed document. There are some proposals within it around which I think there's a fairly broad consensus. Things like making the EHCP process consistent and putting some of that process online. I don't think anybody would disagree that more consistency across the country is a good thing, and the ability for information to be transferred more easily between different agencies that have got a responsibility to an individual child is a good thing. But there are many proposals within it where it's really hard to see how those proposals are going to tackle the problems that the evidence says exist. So, and I know that there's a great deal of concern, and there was a huge response to the government's consultation. I think a majority of it not saying we really agree with these proposals and we want to see them delivered, but saying we're not sure how these proposals really are going to deliver. So I think it's regrettable that the government didn't take a more objective and independent look at the evidence and at what is needed and respond to that with its proposals, rather than bringing forward something which looks like cost cutting, but not on a basis that's particularly evidence led.
It's also very disappointing that they didn't listen to parents and charities working with disabled children as well, because an awful lot of things that were repeated over and over again even make it in.
Yeah, I mean, including things that we delivered on to them on intersectionality, for example, but nothing within the plan reflects any of that. And instead they had things coming out such as all these different national and local boards, which just seems to be putting more and more barriers in the way. What would you have included?
So what you'll hear from Labour frontbenchers, and I know it's really frustrating again and again, is that we're not at the moment going to make promises that we can't clearly deliver. So we don't have a fully fledged plan for SEND, as we don't have for many areas of policy, and that manifesto process is underway, and we'll publish our commitments in due course ahead of the election. But I think that it's really important that there's better partnership working between health and education on SEND. That isn't something that was in the government's plan. And I also think that whole process during the consultation, where parents expressed such strong views and charities and organisations with a huge weight of expertise expressed really strong views, and the government went ahead in the face of that opposition, it is just not a very good way to be working. I would want to be working in partnership with families with experience and the organisations that work alongside children and families, and with local authorities and with other ministers in other departments, to get to a plan and a process that has a higher level of consensus around it, accepting that there are really strong views and people have different and often conflicting views, and it is hard to get to an arrangement that would make everybody feel that it was delivering what they wanted and needed. But I think it's regrettable that there's been such an absence of partnership working to get to these proposals, particularly when there are several of them that it's hard to see, how they're going to make the difference that's needed.
Well, I mean, for example, we are members of the Special Education Consortium, which, as you all know, is a broad range of SEND sector leaders. And we had a consensus document, and everybody tends to agree with that. So I think it was fairly easy for them to see that there is a consensus, and yet they produced all these other things that was not even on anybody's mind. And I think this was the massive disappointment, along with seeing who they put on the implementation board. Just one lot of parents who are, funded by the DFE as well.
So you're well settled into your role now, so you should have a good kind of understanding of how things are. So from your point of view, what do you think the top 3 concerns for SEND parents are, and how would you address each one?
So I think, priorities obviously will differ for different people depending on the circumstances of an individual family. But I think from the engagement that I've had over the last 18 months in this role, I'd say the timeliness of assessments, whether that's an initial diagnosis or whether it's assessment ahead of an EHCP, is the most important thing. And until you have both of those things, it is almost impossible to draw down the support that you need. And what I see is families, childhoods being wasted really, while families wait for those processes to take place, and they can't access that certainty that starts off on the road of being able to draw down support. So I think that would be the first thing. I think secondly, families want a place at a school or indeed a nursery for their child, which meets that child's needs. And for some families, that is in a mainstream setting where the support and the knowledge and the understanding is in place. And for some families, that is a place at a special school. But all too often, I see families being offered places in mainstream schools that they don't feel are equipped to meet their children's needs, and families facing long waits and big battles, and then often very long journey times for their child as well, to access a place at a special school. And then I think the third thing would be just the consistency of support throughout a child's time in education. And I've seen, and I know myself, families who faced a battle when their child was in the early years at nursery initially to get a diagnosis, and then to get an EHCP, who then find that EHCP isn't always updated, it doesn't keep pace with their child's changing needs over time, but they have to battle once again for that support when their child starts primary school. They have to battle again at secondary school. They have to battle again for further education, and that is too much really for families to have to bear and to cope with. So I think it's those 3 things. It's the timeliness of an initial assessment and getting an EHCP if you need one. It's being able to access a place that you're confident is suitable and able to meet your child's needs. And it's the consistency of support and the transitions at the different stages of education, so that support is continuous and ongoing and adapting and evolving to your child's needs, rather than feeling that you have to start all over again at every stage.
There's something that comes up all the time for us as well as accountability. We hear accountability, and you did mention that earlier. I was just the second part of that question was, how would Labour address these issues that are priorities? Has any thought been given to that yet, or is that still part of the manifesto process?
So that's going to be part of the manifesto process, and we'll set out our plans. And I think some of it will be for the other side of the general election, if we are lucky enough to win the election, and we look at how far the government has got with implementing the changes that it is bringing forward at the moment, and what is actually happening on the ground at that point in time. And it's difficult to make plans 18 months out for a situation that is already changing and evolving in reality as well. But I think the first place is looking at that question of inconsistency across the country. Where is there good practice? Why is there good practice in some places and not in other places? And how do we make sure that everybody is performing to the same level with good practice wherever possible? And how can central government be driving that forward. And then I think there is a job to do. So we have a commitment to put in significant additional resource into our schools. We have a plan, a well-publicised plan to charge VAT on private school fees and to use the additional revenue that would be generated by that to support state education. As part of that delivery, I think that will increase the resources in mainstream schools around SEND, and it will enable schools to increase the level of expertise that they have on site. And I think that's really significant. I think there is and there will always be a really important role for special schools and special school places for children who need that. But I speak to many families who've ended up wanting a special school place for their child because their child has been failed in a mainstream environment, but they didn't start out wanting that in the first place. So this question of, as I was saying earlier, about trying to get to a situation where families can be confident in a school place for their child that can meet their child's needs, that is in a setting, whether that's in a mainstream setting or a special school setting. But at the moment, the pressures and the erosion of resources that we've seen in mainstream has massively impacted on the capacity to support children with additional needs in mainstream settings. And I think that would be one of the first places that we would start with that commitment to increase the resources in mainstream.
But just to clarify this, when you're talking about putting a tax on independent schools, you are excluding independent special schools.
We are indeed, yes, yeah, and that's
because
important.
When I first heard this, I thought, what about the independent?
Yeah, no, we are indeed. That's the exemption to that policy.
When you speak to parents, one of the biggest things that they want to see is, as Renata mentioned earlier, is accountability. So you get the EHCP and it's not carried out, or it's not updated, or your application is unlawfully rejected, and nothing happens to those local authorities. So there is no incentive to do it right. Even when you complain and it goes through to the ombudsman or to the tribunal, nothing happens to them in the end. They might get a little slap on their wrist, but where is the incentive? And so this system of accountability takes too long, and it is often ineffective. Have you been contacted a lot about this, and what are your thoughts in that direction?
So I think what I want to see is a process for driving improvement. I think it's really hard to think about sanctions and that kind of enforcement process where local authorities simply don't have the resources or the capacity or the internal knowledge to deliver. I mean, you can punish somebody for doing something that it's not within their gift to deliver on, and sometimes there is poor practice and sometimes there is a need for that kind of accountability. But if we look at a system that is so stretched across the country, I think it is more helpful to think about it in terms of a process of improvement that is driven from the centre, that of course involves looking at resources, but starts with, where is there good practice? What does good practice look like? And why isn't everybody modelling that? And what is the advice and support and incentives, and if needed, processes around accountability to make sure that every local authority is performing as well as the best. And I think there is a job to do from central government to give visibility to that work, to be driving that work forward, and to be saying that we accept and understand and acknowledge the constraints on resources, but there is no excuse for inconsistency. So what can the government do about that? And I think that's important. I think it's a role that's about leadership and drive and ambition and the willingness to get stuck in and try to make things better.
I mean, obviously, money is a big issue, and the government is repeatedly saying that they're increasing funding. And while they are putting in more money, it's still playing catch up with years of underfunding. What does Labour think they can do to help to ensure that the delegated SEND budget is boosted, that it's ring fenced from other school budgets, and that SENCO gets to decide where it goes?
So I'm not going to make specific commitments about funding at the moment. That is, you know, a process that is, again, will happen closer to the election. We will only put forward proposals that are fully costed and fully funded, and we know how we're going to pay for them. But the process of making sure that within schools, funding that is for children with additional needs is spent on children with additional needs and meeting those needs. That's important. It's important that there's accountability there in that process, and it is important that we, look at what the legacy of 13 years of the government stripping away resources from local authorities, while also trashing the economy and making the economic situation even worse. So they go, we've here in the news this week, there's a lot of discussion around the impact of the budget back in October on people's mortgages, which is now kicking in because all of the fixed term mortgages are coming to an end or being renewed. But we shouldn't forget that also makes things much more challenging for the government, because it forces up the cost of government borrowing as well, and government debt. So it's hard to overstate the constraints that there are around funding, and how challenging it might be to start for an incoming Labour government to start to put in the resource where it's really needed. And I don't want to be misleading about those challenges. I think it's really important we're upfront about how hard it might be, but certainly it's important that there is accountability, and it's important that there is SENCO provision in and resource in schools. I met with schools and heard from teachers where that resource has been so eroded that it really isn't present at the moment to the extent that's needed.
Do you agree in principle that money should be ring fenced, though? Because it's something that the incumbent government isn't keen on doing, but it does mean that it's much harder to hold people accountable for SEND budgets if there isn't that ring fencing.
That there is, I mean, having been a local councillor and having sat on the scrutiny committee in Parliament that looks at local government, that there are good reasons why there's a lot of resistance to ring fencing. Local government is autonomous from central government. It has a separate democratic accountability to the electorate at a local level, and different areas of the country have different challenges in different ways. So I think the thing that's most important is what are the impacts, and how effective is the expenditure, and how effective is the leadership in that local area at really delivering good outcomes for children and their families. It is, of course, really important that where funding is allocated through the EHCP process for an individual child, there is transparency and accountability about how that money is being spent to the benefit of that child. That is the whole purpose of the system that we have for EHCPs, which recognises very specific individual needs over and above the general SEND needs within a school population, which is funded in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, there is still a lot of opacity about when a child, for example, has their own TA allocated to them, and yet that TA funded by that child, the EHCP, is moved and given to somebody else, or given asked to watch the whole class. So there is it is a very complex situation to figure out. But then the government can ring fence when they want to, and they do. It's just in this area it seems that it's something that they don't want to do. But we're also seeing in things like mental health, for example, more and more schools are being expected to have in-school counsellors, because getting an appointment at CAMHS virtually impossible, even when a child has severe difficulties. So the government's tried various initiatives over the years that we've covered on special needs, but it just doesn't seem to be getting any better. so within the bounds of what you can say, what would you like to see for things like CAMS and for things like mental health support in schools? Because on the other hand, teachers can't be everything to everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think mental health is so fundamental. It was important before the pandemic, but we've also seen a huge impact from the pandemic on children and young people's mental health. And if you don't have good mental health and well-being, that's fundamental to being able to access the rest of your education. So we think this is really important, and we have announced a firm commitment to put a mental health professional into every school in the country, every secondary school in the country, and to make a mental health resource available to every primary school in the country, so that there is somewhere for children and for teachers who are concerned about children and young people to turn to seek help and support from somebody who's suitably qualified to perform that role and has that expertise. Because you're completely right, teachers are trained in teaching, but they end up being counsellors and social workers and the food bank and so many other roles that draw on their time and energy and resources, which should be able to be deployed in teaching the class. We also have a commitment to put an open access mental health hub in every community in the country. And again, that's really important because we know that CAMS waiting lists are so long, and that while children and young people are sitting on a waiting list, often their mental health is deteriorating, and then it becomes a much more difficult issue to tackle. I've seen this in action firsthand in my local area. So Southwark have set up a provision called the Nest, which is an open access mental health hub, and it's made an enormous difference. It just means that when a parent or carer becomes concerned about a young person, they've got somewhere to go for initial help and support. And often, if that mental health need is at a relatively early stage, that help and support can be provided through the Nest, which stops it from worsening and becoming a much bigger problem. So that's something that we'd like to see everywhere across the country, as well as and I can't speak for my health colleagues, but I know that Rosanna Allen-Khan, as the Shadow Secretary of State for Mental Health, is very committed to delivering true parity of esteem for mental and physical health, and making sure that the resources in the NHS for children's mental health are able to meet the very, very extensive need that there is at the moment.
And we're seeing it more with school anxiety and children not being able to go to school. We see it in the absence figures as well.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's something that obviously needs to be tackled to get children back into school.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, there are lots of initiatives at the moment, obviously, around mental health and young people from the current government. But one of the issues that we've seen, certainly locally and nationally, is that a lot of these schemes don't incorporate special educational needs within that mental health support. So it's fine for maybe emergent needs, but it doesn't get anywhere close to meeting the needs of children with additional needs. And so there's a big gap there where all of this money and expertise is being put into supporting mental health, but still, the more vulnerable children are cut out of that help because they all, and also, it relies on parents being able to be engaged. So it's very, very reliant on parent participation in order to carry out, which again, it cuts out vulnerable families. Have you considered that as part of the schemes that you want to roll out?
Yeah, so I think having a resource in schools is really significant, because that's putting the resource into where children are and into a place where children have that direct relationship and can ask for help and support. I think there is also something to be looked at around the level of knowledge and expertise that teachers have through their training around additional needs. And we are seeing increased presentation of additional needs for many complex reasons, I think not all of which are fully understood. But it is now the case that in every classroom across the country, there are likely to be children with additional needs, and yet we don't do very much within the teacher training framework as it is at the moment, to equip teachers to teach every child in their class and to identify and to understand the different needs that might be present in a classroom. So I think there is more that can be done across the board, and more that can be done at looking at the inclusivity of schools, and how they are equipped in terms of knowledge and expertise to be able to cater to a more diverse range of needs.
I think we definitely agree with you around the teacher training. It's something we've spoken at length about previously. We are also seeing an increase in parents being accused of FII, which stands for fabricated or induced illness, sometimes as a way of deferring them for asking for help or making a complaint about provision their child isn't getting. While safeguarding is obviously very, very important, how would Labour try and balance this to ensure that parents aren't being wrongfully blamed, and that people in health and education aren't using it as a tool to silence parents?
So I think this is about looking at that question of good practice and consistency across the country. And it would certainly be interesting, I haven't looked at the data, but it would certainly be interesting to understand if this is more of an issue in some areas than others. Because if that was the case, that would point to practice which wasn't able to build relationships of trust with parents, and so was acting in a, perhaps in a way that's disproportionately suspicious of parents, or where parents themselves didn't trust the professionals in a particular area to deliver for them. So I suppose I'd be really interested in the pattern of that presentation, and whether is it something that's happening everywhere, in which case perhaps we need a bit more work to understand what is good practice, what can stop a relationship between professionals and parents getting to that situation, which clearly also represents a breakdown of that relationship, or whether it's something that is more prevalent in other areas, in which case there might be something more specific going on at a local level that needs to be explored.
I mean, I think there is some postcode lottery for certain. But I think certainly from our point of view, part of the problem is the national guidelines that have come out, which highlight soft signs of abuse, which unfortunately also describe many behaviours you'll see, from disabled children. So disabled children are being disproportionately sort of falling under these signs of being abused, when actually it's not, it's just characteristics of their disability. And also there's no accountability or monitoring of any of the allegations that are being made. So we don't actually know how often families are being accused of FII, and then that accusation goes nowhere. So arguably, sort of incorrectly accusing a family of abusing their child, it has a knock-on effect, and that child then not getting the services that they need, which then means that their condition deteriorates potentially, which in itself is harming the child. So it's incredibly important to us that actually we monitor everything. If you look in healthcare, everything's monitored, every surgery, every outcome, we're absolutely aware, and there's always reviews if things aren't going right. Whereas safeguarding seems to be an area that no one's willing to touch. No one's willing to say, actually, we need rules and regulations to make sure the people who are meant to be safeguarding children aren't abusing that power. Is that something, do you think, that Labour would be on board addressing?
Well, so I think that's certainly a really important set of issues, and it will. One of the things that is also a great frustration to me is that I have, as a shadow minister, we have next to no resource if you're the minister, you have the whole of the civil service to be able to draw down data and look at what's happening and so on, and it's frustration that we don't have that resource. But certainly that's an issue that I'd want to be sort of drilling down into in much more detail, and understanding exactly why that's happening and where it's happening. I think there is good practice that I don't always see. It is for local authorities to be joining up work on school absence and attendance and send professionals, and I've seen examples where the absence team will be taking, quite a skeptical and interventionist approach with the family, but without pulling that into the ongoing work, like the wait for an EHCP or the wait for an assessment, or that kind of thing. I think where you have a child who has additional needs, it's important, if there is absence from school, that the reasons for that absence are located in the context of what support is being provided around the additional needs, and is that fit for purpose, and is it being properly delivered. So yeah, I mean, hugely complicated, but I think there's definitely a job to do to understand it and to work out what changes are needed.
One of the difficulties you're going to find is there is no data other than data that's been collected from charitable organisations, because, as I say, the government doesn't monitor it in any way. So perhaps that's something that Labour could do, is to actually start monitoring what's going on. That would be incredibly valuable.
Yeah.
And it is across health, education and social care, but, and for different reasons as well. But let's turn to behaviour, and in particular, something that is, a massive problem for disabled children, that is these zero tolerance behaviour policies. They leave disabled children at a disadvantage, and they're often, particularly anti-inclusive. How do we make behaviour and attendance policies just fair to all?
So I think, again, it's about looking at what really works rather than what is a rhetoric that, politicians might think sounds good. I think I always reflect on, and I might have talked to you both about this before, the experience of a friend of my oldest daughter in primary school who had I didn't have an autistic spectrum diagnosis. Actually, that was one of the issues, was that he didn't have a diagnosis, but he had, I think he now has an autistic spectrum diagnosis. And every single year at his school, how his experience of being in school was entirely determined by the extent to which the teacher understood that his behaviour was a expression of his anxiety, and his behavior could be pretty challenging, but he behaved in those ways when he was anxious because he didn't properly understand, or hadn't been properly prepared for what was going to happen in the school day. And what I saw throughout the 6 years of primary school, 6-7 years of primary school, was some years where that little boy's teacher absolutely understood what he needed to get through the day, and he did really well, was a super high achieving child. And years when the teacher didn't understand and treated him as a naughty boy, and his mom was being called every other day to come and collect him from school, and the whole year was a disaster. And it was really heartbreaking in those years where it was going wrong, because all of us in the parent community and the parents of his friends and so on knew him and knew what he was capable of doing, and the support that he needed, and to see years when the school just couldn't deliver that was very, very hard indeed. So what I'm interested in, I mean, that the schools policy and behaviour policy falls to my colleague Stephen Morgan, who's the Shadow Minister for Schools, and I talked to him about this area. But what I'm interested in is what's effective and what really works. We all want schools to be calm, ordered, constructive, productive environments where every child can get the best from their education. It's in nobody's interests to have school environments that are chaotic or disruptive, but I believe you get there by making sure that children are properly supported with the needs that they bring into the classroom, not always by bearing down on them like a ton of bricks in ways that is can be counterproductive to the reasons that underlie that behaviour.
I think one of the big concerns of ours from the implementation plan was the big focus on controlling behaviour rather than understanding need. So using alternative provision to basically as behavioural control centres, so you can then send a child straight back to the situation that caused it in the first place, and there's no mention of actually understanding what's going on at school and understanding what's going on from the child's point of view, in order to seeing the behaviour as communication, as you meant.
Yeah. And the anecdote you talk about there, your friend, your daughter's friend, is something that is down to training, really, and consistency throughout a school. It's unacceptable that it happens one year and not another year. In fact, this happened with my own children, and why they ended up going from a mainstream school to an independent specialist school, because they needed that consistency from year to year. They needed to know that the support they would get in one year would be there in the next year, which they did get at Morehouse, where they went to, but they weren't getting because of the different levels of training within the staff in the school. One was just in a second year, whereas a different teacher was excellent at that kind of thing. And that is difficult, but if we train teachers to teach children with SEND, then which isn't happening at the moment, then that would be a huge step forward. So teacher training is something presumably that you're going to be looking at.
No, indeed. Some more knowledge can make an enormous difference, that's certainly one of the things that's needed.
Well, that's all we have time for today. Helen, thank you so much for your time with us and giving us an insight into Labour's thoughts on SEND.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We hope you've enjoyed listening as well, and don't forget to like, subscribe, etc., so you don't miss future episodes.
For now, once again, thank you, Helen, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.